14 molecules, and then they are made up of mainly 20 naturally occurring amino acids. And so these amino acids have specific side chain groups. Side chain groups. And then so that you have 20 functional groups which can actually interact pairwise, even with more groups come together and interact in a combination, gives rise to stabilization to these molecules, right? And we have discussed about secondary structures and tertiary structure important structure. But then in the secondary structure, we mainly talked about the stabilization coming from hydrogen bonding because it's easy to specify the hydrogen bonding in secondary structures in helices or beta sheets. Okay, because we know that where the interaction is coming from. So amide NH and amide CO interacting from different parts of the polypeptide gives rise to stabilization. But we haven't really discussed about the role of side chains. Okay, so there are 20 amino acids. Now we have 20 different side chains, and these side chains come in different varieties, right? Okay, so broadly we discussed about charged. For example, lysine side chain positive charge, or arginine positive charge, or glutamic acid, aspartic acid negative charge, and polar. Okay, so polar means it could be tyrosine, cysteine, serine, for example, which have OH group, or it could be non-polar. Okay, so non-polar like tryptophan, tyrosine, okay, not tyrosine, phenylalanine, etc. Okay, so like you can actually classify these into this. Okay, but now, so each side chain is different from any other side chain because specificity. Some, for example, even non-polar side chains like valine, isoleucine, leucine, they are different from each other. So now any pairwise these side chains can interact with each other when protein forms a tertiary structure, okay, or within the secondary structure if it forms a beta sheet. So then how do you classify these interactions, and then which interactions are strong? So to know that, so then we need to really go into details about pairwise interactions. Okay? So let's look simple pairwise. Okay. So in the case of charge, let's say charge or ion. Okay. Charge. So example is basically lysine. Okay. So lysine, a positively charged amino acid versus, let's say, a negatively charged amino acid, let's say aspartic acid or aspartic. Okay, so this is basically charge interactions between a positively charged side chain to a negatively charged this. So this is basically attractive, okay, because they are oppositely charged, right? Okay. So then, but the energy depends on how far they are from each other, okay? And sometimes these are for solvages as well, because these are positive and negative charges. So let's say they are separated by a distance r, okay? From, let's say, one center to center. So you are treating simply like point charges. So then the interaction energy basically depends on the charges. Okay, so here the charges are basically +1, Q1 and Q2, and then the distance between them. Okay, so it's basically inversely proportional to R. And of course, you have constants. Okay, so 1/4π epsilon naught and if they are in water or any other medium, then basically you have the dielectric constant. So epsilon is the dielectric constant of the medium. For example, for water it is 80. R is the distance between the charges, treating them as point charges. Q1 and Q2 are the charges from the charges which are interacting, and 4 pi epsilon naught. Epsilon naught is basically permittivity of vacuum. Okay, so basically it's 1 over R dependence. That's what we need to do. 1 over R dependence. Okay, so this is for all the charged or ion interactions. So it could be lysine, arginine, it could be aspartic acid. Yes. Okay. So now let's move to ion versus non-charged thing. Okay. So polar. Okay. So this can be also labeled as charge. Sometimes you write a dipole. Okay. So charge means that you have complete charge. It could be +1, +2 in principle, because this is a generalized expression. Any charge has it. Okay, charge. A dipole is are basically molecules which don't have any formal charge on them, but yet they have electron distribution in them, polarized. So you have basically a delta plus and delta minus. Okay, so in the molecule, so we have sometimes represented as dipole. Okay, so dipoles, depending on how they are oriented, they can interact with charges, they can interact with other dipoles. So let's say there is interaction between a charge and dipole. So charged molecule could be side chain, could be lysine, arginine, aspartic acid, any of them. And so what is example for, let's say, polar molecules, which are not charged? Any example for the polar
Serine.
side chain?
Tyrosine.
Serine.
Methionine.
Tyrosine.
Tyrosine, methionine. Okay, so you can really look up in the 20 amino acids, and then you can really look molecules, functional groups of the side chains which are not charged, but which could be polar. So in this case, so basically the dependence is 1 over R2. Okay, so basically the distance between the point charge and the dipole. Okay, so now dipole has orientation. Unlike the charge, okay, point charges, they don't have any direction. The dipoles have direction. So in this case, we are talking about, let's say, if it is a minus charge. So then the dipole interaction, we are talking about orientation of the dipole such that plus is towards the negative charge and minus is positive. Okay, this is the orientation. But if the charge is positive, then of course dipole is other. So dipole orientation is actually important. So that's for the dipole, charge dipole. Okay. So another combination we can actually have is dipole interaction. Okay. So then you have two side chains. Okay. Both are polar and both have a dipoles. So these are called permanent dipoles. Okay, are basically molecules which have dipole moment, permanent dipole. So then let's see if we have positive and negative, okay, dipole. Then the next dipole is also oriented in a way that the negative charge of the dipole is oriented to be positive charge, and this is the direction. Okay, so these are orientation dependent. So here also orientation of the dipole. So here basically orientation of both dipoles. Okay, orientation of both dipoles. here, again, if you treat this as R, so then you have R dependence. Okay, so the R dependence for dipole is 1 over, okay, 1 over R cube, okay, 1 over R3 or 1 over R cube. So ion, so it's 1 over R dependent, and sometimes it's called Coulomb interaction, small gauge, or Coulomb interaction. Okay, so if you had actually basically physics course, electrodynamics or electrostatics, so basically you study that. That's the first thing one would actually study. Okay, charge interaction. So that's 1 over R, and this ion, polar or charge dipole, it's 1 over R square. Dipole, it's 1 over R cube, and these are orientation dependent. Because if you bring in, if you don't bring orientation dependence, then of course, then the dependence will actually change. So what is the other combination we can really think of? Okay, so these are polar molecules, polar side chains, right? So now what is the other variety of the side chains? Okay, we talked about charged side chains where you have a formal charge +1 or -1. Then polar side chains where actually the functional groups have electron distribution distributed asymmetrically so that they have permanent dipole moment. So what is the other type of side chains we can really think of?
The hydrophobic side chains, the nonpolar ones.
Ion-induced dipole, sir.
Side chains are the side chains don't have any permanent dipole moment. Okay, so this is not strictly correct because only molecules which are really symmetric, okay, and neutral, you can really think of don't have any permanent dipole moment. But the moment you add side chains to side chains, because you already bring in asymmetry. So in principle, these are not completely non-polar, okay? But for the sake of taking close to non-polar thing, so we assume, for example, let's say phenylalanine, okay, as completely non-polar, okay, or tryptophan, okay, they have very small dipole moment, but for the sake of argument, okay. So these are molecules we are talking about large dipole, okay. Yes. So in the case of dipole interaction, the packing also equals to the dipole. The packing. The backbone. The backbone is also, yeah, but here we are strictly talking about side chains. Yes, but let's consider the backbone as well. Oh, yes. How large or small is yes. So then you have to really think about the dipole is really large. So then that center of mass will be far away from the other dipole which you are talking about. Then automatically your R is going to be large. Either you treat a system as a lot of point charges, the point dipoles, smaller, so that they are interacting. Or if you treat with entire amino acid along with the backbone as a single entity, so then you have a different dipole moment, okay? But finally, all these equations which we write are strictly for example, when we say charge, it's point charges. The equations are derived assuming that entire charge is at the point. But typically, you never have a charge as a point. It has a radius of space. So if you bring in that, of course, then these equations are not really valid. But these are very good approximations to understand what's happening. Okay, so the other one is that basically side chains which are not polar or non-polar. Okay, so this non-polar side chain, okay, can interact with now it can interact with ion case, it can interact with polar. Okay, so let's say if it is interacting with ion, okay, basically a charge. But in the presence of these charges, okay, are other dipole functional groups. Though they are completely non-polar, don't have any dipole moment themselves, but they can transiently induce a dipole in this non-polar molecule because of this. Basically, to begin with, initially it doesn't have any dipole moment. But then the molecule actually gets let's say if it is positive charge, it gets a small negative charge here and then positive charge here. That is in the presence of this. Okay. So this is because this dipole is developed in the presence of this. So these are called induced dipole. Okay. And the important property of molecules that should have in this dipole is basically polarizability. Means the ability of the functional group or the molecule, okay, to displace the charges or displace the charge distribution easily so that it can actually interact with the ion or dipole, is that ability is called polarizability. If this can be displaced very easily, then polarizability is very high. If this cannot, then polarizability is very high. Okay. So now, so induced dipole, though functional groups can be non-polar or molecules can be non-polar. So then they can actually have induced dipole and ion interaction. So induced dipole ion interactions, the is basically 1 over R4 dependence. Okay. So here, so again, it depends on what is a molecule and what is a functional group. Is it symmetric or asymmetric? If it is really asymmetric, then of course it will be orientation dependent. But if it is symmetric, then it will not have orientation. So another case is that induced dipole can interact with, let's say, another dipole. Okay, so dipole is basically a permanent one. Okay, but then you can actually induce a dipole in other non-polar functional groups. This is again transient dipole or induced dipole. So this interaction, again, this is completely orientation dependent. Okay, the dipole, how the dipole is oriented is very important, because so it can influence to, let's orient something like this. So the way this interacts with this molecule is different than this. So you have to keep that in mind. So orientation dependent. So this is basically R of 1. Other than salt bridges or charge interactions, almost everything else is actually orientation. How either the permanent dipole or the non-polar functional group orientation actually dictates how they might act. Okay, but you can have non-polar interactions, which are very, very common. So you can have induced dipole versus induced dipole. Okay, so you can have two non-polar molecules sitting right next to each other, but transiently one actually develops a dipole. Okay, so these fluctuations of charges are very common in functional groups. The moment it just develops transiently this dipole, this actually induces a dipole in this. Okay, so this is induced dipole interaction. So this has R power 6 dimensions. Okay, so we looked almost like 1 over R to 1 over R6. I think all 6 cases. Okay. So which one is basically strongest? Let's say if you have two moieties. Okay. So in this case, the dependence is 1 over R6, means that it drops very fast, means that these actually occur very short distances or long distances. Okay, at very short distance. The moment you increase the distance by small amount, that because of the power 6, it drops. Okay, so basically it drops very fast in this case of this. And ion-ion interactions or charge-charge interactions are 1 over R. So basically, they tend to really last long. So that's why simply you call ion-ion interactions are actually long distance based interactions, but the induced dipole are short distance. Okay, and this, so typically we call a van der Waals interaction. Okay, sometimes a dispersion, or sometimes it's even called London attraction. Okay, so because of this induced dipole attraction, okay, this is always attraction, because to begin with they don't have any dipoles, but the moment one develops induced, you exactly have a complementary one, so that it's always attract, unless the groups are bound with each other. So sometimes it's called London attraction. Okay. So when it comes to like van der Waals, so
Sir,
you know what's called Lennard-Jones.
sir, I have a question.
Yes.
Sir, is there any reason why it is called a dispersive force? I mean, dispersion.
I think the meaning is basically, I think this transient distribution of fluctuation of the charges, you know,
Okay.
I think gives rise to this transient, let's say, dipole moment. And then
Okay.
this basically induces this dispersion. I think that's the meaning, I guess.
Okay.
I don't know if there is any other strong in-depth meaning other than that. Okay. Okay, so when it comes to van der Waals interactions, so you tend to, so though it is actually 1 for R distance, this is basically for the attractive reason. But if they're really bumping into each other much closer distance, of course they repel. So any of these interactions, again, you can really think of representing as a base of R. Okay, as you vary the distance between two moieties, it could be ion-ion, or it could be charged dipole, or induced dipole.
Sir, I have a question.
Okay.
Sir, this last interaction is orientation dependent.
Interaction. Huh?
Sir, is this last interaction induced dipole, is this orientation dependent?
So basically, it's yes and no, in the sense that if the orientation is not right of, let's say, the second one, though you have a dipole developed here, if it is not able to, for example, let's say if your molecule is certain orientation, then you can develop this delta plus and delta minus easily. But imagine if the molecule is actually oriented slightly differently. So then you might not be able to develop, okay, delta minus and delta plus. Okay, so let's say if a molecule, let's say, which is, for the sake of argument, let's say cylindrical or oval shape. Okay, so then maybe it's easy to develop charges here. Okay, but let's say the same molecule oriented slightly different. So then it's basically you have to really see that, because this is the direction along which this is oriented, right? Then you need to develop a positive charges here and negative charge here. Okay, I'm not sure if it is visible. Let's say if it is positive and negative, which might be very difficult. Okay.
Okay, sir.
This is again coming back to polarizability. You know, how you
Yes,
can actually gauge the electron cloud distribution in the model. It can be easier in certain directions, which might not be easier. Okay. So in that
Okay.
sense, if you fix the orientation of this, okay, so there may be a strong interaction might be possible. With the same molecule, let's say now, if you orient different, then you might not be able to displace. Okay, or the induced dipole strength is less. If the strength is less, then of course, though it is R power 6 dependence, but finally it depends on how much actually you are able to induce the charge. What is a delta? Okay, in the case of Coulomb interactions, literally we write Q1, Q2 because Q1, Q2 is basically could be +1 in the case of, let's say, lysine and aspartic acid. But Q1, Q2 can be in principle partial charges, right? It could be fraction. But if that is very small, then your interaction is not going to be strong. So in that sense, it's orientation dependent. Okay, or in other
Yes.
ways, orientation is fixed, but the thing is that then interaction strength is less.
Okay. Sir, I also have one small question, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, induced dipole to induced dipole interaction, they are not independent. Means a charge moiety or a polar moiety will be needed to induce this kind of thing.
Definitely. But
so
finally,
yeah,
we see that and two ions, okay,
yeah,
can have this, but the thing is that you see the R power 6 dependence. Okay.
yeah, so that's what I'm asking. Let us suppose if we have a one ion, the electric field of this will induce the induced dipole to induced dipole interaction.
Yes.
So I am saying that then in that case, what interaction will be more favorable, ion or induced dipole, or this one, or we are taking the
right? So ion interaction. So that's actually this graph will help you to think about. So the moment you have, this is the weakest interaction. But if you have
are we taking the
interaction than this, that's going to dominate. For example, let's if you take two ions, okay, positive and negative. So already have formal fixed charges, that's Coulomb interaction.
Yeah.
But the moment you bring in these charges, again, maybe something more asymmetric distribution, okay? So within even the ion, the charges might be displaced, though it is actually completely formally charged. So you have additional induced dipole interactions, but that interaction is so minusculely small compared to your ion-ion interactions, you can actually ignore this. The dominating
Sir, I am asking that for the induced dipole to induced dipole interaction to happen, we need some positive charge or a positive charge due to a single point charge or a charge due to the some permanent dipole.
No, if you say induced dipole interactions, okay, so then you have a molecule which has only transient dipole interaction, which brings so this dipole we are talking about, okay, doesn't have to be as strong as a dipole moment. Okay, second thing is, which is time dependent, fluctuating, means that it's not really permanent. Okay, so though this is attractive, but again this is oscillating. Unlike in permanent dipole moment, the dipole moment is fixed, means the charge distribution is asymmetric. At any point of time, if you see, it's asymmetric. But induced dipole is oscillating. Okay, so it's oscillating. But in the absence of any other dipole, it oscillates. It can be delta minus, delta plus, delta minus. It could be neutral. But the moment another induced dipole is created, so then this oscillation frequency might get reduced depending on how strongly they are interacting. But in the permanent dipole case, it's permanent. Whether another moiety, a charged, another induced dipole or another dipole is there or not, this dipole moment is fixed. Charged case, charge is fixed irrespective of what is there in the dipole. But in the case of induced dipoles, these are really oscillating. Okay, this is not constant. Second thing is that the R power dependence, that's what actually we are really talking about. So the ion. So if you have two ions, okay, which can be really placed farther from each other, okay, so still they could be interacting. But if the same moiety suddenly you say that, okay, you're not ions anymore, you are only dipoles. So then the interaction at the same distance is minuscule. To make them interact, you have to bring them to closer because it's R power 3 dependence. Okay, but the moment you say that you are not dipoles anymore, you are actually non-polar neutral molecules. You don't have any permanent dipole moment. At the same same distance as dipoles, the interaction will be minuscule because it's now 1,4 R for 6 dependence. So you have to bring them to much closer. Now, if you ask, let's say these two are now not induced dipoles, they are ions. Of course, now they are so close, the interaction energy is very, very strong. Okay, so 1/R, right? R is so small, so 1/R is large. So you don't have to really worry about now induced dipole because your charge is actually dominate. Okay, so it's very, very high. Okay, so
Sir, I have a question.
yeah.
Sir, so this is only induced dipole only between two molecules, maybe possibly between 3 or 4 molecules also
Could
at a
you
time.
repeat? I couldn't hear you properly.
Am I audible now?
Yeah, better.
So I am saying that this is induced dipole. Induced dipole is only between two molecules. It can be possible between 3 or 4 molecules at a time. Because since
then you have to really invoke a much complex. It's possible. That's what is reality. Okay. So when we really discuss the simplest cases. Okay. So, but let's say if you bring in another induced dipolar, let's say another charge, you have let's say simplest cases you have one charge, then you have another charge. It's easy to discuss this case. Okay. But now let's say if you have another charge, another charge, another charge. Okay. So now you can actually really think of all pairwise interactions. Okay. To give rise to basically the total energy. That's what is basically electrodynamics. Either you say that one charge in the sea of other charges. Okay. Either you say the effective field coming from all charges, or you can think of pairwise interactions, their distances and orientation. You can really sum. Okay, so this is basically what they do in electrodynamics. So obviously in the reality, you have not just two moieties come together, but you have many moieties. But you can think of pairwise interactions, or you can really think that, so if you take all these negative charges, okay, so what is the effective charge at any point in space because of these charges you can really think of. So now you can really say that, okay, at this point, what is the effective electric field, okay, generated by all this sea of negative ions? That's basically the charge actually which is interacting with this. Okay, so there are multiple ways to really think of. Yes, that's the reality, but we don't really tend to do that. But there are ways to do that in electrodynamics. Okay. But let's come back to this. So whatever we said that 1/R dependence for all these interactions. So you can really think of in terms of how the interaction energy, pairwise interaction with R. Okay. So you learned in your college basically van der Waals interaction. It says that basically when two molecules are actually very far from each other at a long distance, then the energy of them is actually very small. But the moment actually they are brought together, okay, so the energy, the interaction actually increases. So basically you see kind of stabilization, okay. So basically the moment basically I'm decreasing the R between them, and then how their interaction energy is actually changing. So as you brought them closer to closer, and then you reach a minimum, and then if you push them further, then basically they begin to repel from each other, and then actually it goes. Okay, it shoots up very fast. And so this is the distance at which, okay, so this is the distance at which they're actually more stable. And this is your van der Waals radius. So if you have actually two molecules, okay, so I'm assuming that they're both similar. So let's say spherical, okay, so that's your radius of 1, and that's, sorry, that's, it should be centimeter, okay, radius of 2. So basically this is R1 plus R2, Okay, so let's say if you have two spherical particles, so they're not really interacting and R is very large. But the moment you decrease the R, they're actually stabilized, the most stable interaction at a distance called R0. That's basically center to center. So that's nothing but the sum of R1 plus R2, and these are called sum of van der Waals radius. Sum of van der, okay, radius. So basically, two spheres basically touching each other. But if you push them any further than R0, so then they collide with each other, okay, begin to repel. And then if you push further, of course, the interaction energy shoots up. And this is the same thing is written as your Lennard-Jones potential. Okay, potential, which you're familiar if you have done physical chemistry classes. Otherwise, it says that it's basically you have two R power dependence. Okay, so one, as you bring from infinity, okay, so this is basically stabilizing. Okay, so I don't have different color chart, but let's see if I have to represent this part of the curve. Okay, so this is 1 power R power 6. That's what is actually we are really talking about when we say 1 power R power 6 dependent. And this is negative. And but when you push further, so there is a repulsive thing. Okay, so which goes this. So this is much steeper than this. That's 1 power R power 12. Okay, so that's basically 1 power R. And of course, you have constants and whatnot. I think there is sigma. So this is basically Lennard-Jones potential. You say that this is attracting point. Okay, and this is a repulsive point. Okay, so the repulsion is basically changes very rapidly than the attraction, and then only sign is difference. Okay, you see one is on the positive side, another is this side. So that's basically how you think about van der Waals interaction between induced dipole and induced dipole. Okay.
Sir, I have a general question.
Yes.
So this may not be related to biochemistry, but in periodic table, we see that those noble gases, we have a van der Waals radius value given. So how do we experimentally determine those values?
Good question. How does one determine the van der Waals radius? I don't know, but let's think. How do any idea, Mithande? I don't know, but let me think.
Maybe
yeah. Yes, Prithvish?
No, I guess Prateep was saying something. Prateep.
no, sir. I am thinking that maybe from the this Lennard-Jones potential, that is from these energy interactions. Like if we calculate the energy from the induced dipole, then we can calculate the R value.
This is a theoretical calculation. What I'm asking is
to very defined.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's say if you make them liquid. Okay. So let's say if you take a gas and if you liquefy them, okay, you can actually measure the density.
Yes.
Right. So if you know the density, So now you can actually measure, assuming spherical shapes, you can actually measure the average particle separation, right?
Yes.
So let's say if you do that, average
Okay,
particle
sir, can we do one thing
that
that
should be very close to van der Waals radius, I guess.
yeah, we take
Because
the
they are
point.
not really bonding, they are just interacting, that's a stable interaction, but they're not really repelling so much that the liquid is coming. So I would presume that, let's say if you liquefy a gas, okay, let's say monoatomic gas, and then if you know the density, so you can actually calculate the average interparticle separation. I presume that should be very close to your van der Waals radius.
Sir, we can take the point where the density is maximum, so that in that.
Okay, Prithvish, finish.
I am saying that there can be many values of densities as we change the temperature. I am saying that what if we take the maximum density condition at maybe a certain
No, see, there
pressure?
are two ways to think. So one is liquid, where actually particles are actually moving, okay, and then solid. So typically the densities do not really vary a lot between liquids and solids. Only thing is that their mobility, okay, changes. Of course, there should be small change because the molecules are actually free to move. But
But
let's
sir,
say
in solid,
this, yeah, between the solid and let's say liquid, the density change will not be enormous compared to a liquid to let's say gas. Okay, so I presume that either you can take a liquid or you can take a solid. Okay, and then you can actually model the average particle separation. That you can actually consider your van der Waals radius. Okay, again, see, it's not a really fixed number, you know. So these clouds, okay, remember when I showed you the Ramachandran plot for the polyglycine and polyalanine, I showed you allowed regions, okay,
yes,
disallowed or partially allowed. Means that partially allowed means that it's not that just after van der Waals radius, let's say R naught, the moment you say that R naught minus small, let's say delta R, doesn't mean that they go very rapidly, okay? Still you see this region, so
yes,
still it's actually negative. Means that this is it's not positive. Means that even during that pushing, which is smaller than R naught, still they are stabilizing. Okay,
attractive.
so you can really think of these scenarios. I think now the answer could be to estimate van der Waals radius. I think either you liquefy, okay, you make either a liquid, okay, or assume a solid. Or the difference between liquid and solid is that in liquid you have the freedom for the particles to move across each other. In the solid, they are actually fixed, maybe slightly little stronger contact, okay, between the particles so that they don't allow, okay. But in liquid, maybe slightly less. I'm sure in both cases, you actually bump into this region, okay, but not actually beyond this because above zero, then it might not be stable.
Yes.
I think that's the way. Basically, you can assume from the liquid or the solid, you can actually get. Mitadeep was saying something. Mm. That is, you have different densities and different temperatures, and essentially this is a thermal effect. What you get is like a mean free path. So those make it related to the van der Waals. Mean free path, typically you talked about, yes. See, generally you can really talk about whether gas, solid or liquid, you can talk about mean free path. But that's exactly what we are talking about, average interparticle separation. So that's nothing but basically mean free path. So one can actually really do. Yes, the temperature dependence is there. So, but let's say if you take solid, you know, so in solid basically doesn't really matter the moment it becomes solid. You know, the temperature effect on the density will be extremely minimal, if at all there is, because they're not going to really change much. Within liquid, yes, maybe, okay, but of course, huge effect comes in gas. I think Pritesh, that's the answer. So
Sir,
Sir, I have a question.
Sir, from the van der Waals equation, there is a term B. So from that B, can we calculate the van der Waals radius?
Yeah, so that's basically the ideal gas, deviation from ideal gas laws, right? Because you always, ideal gases, you assume that particles are points, they don't have occupy any space, etc. So that B comes basically, the molecules actually are the gas molecules occupy certain space. Again, B is related to van der Waals. Okay, maybe I think B is considered as van der Waals radius, I guess. Okay.
Sir, I have a question. Sir.
So let me finish something. Okay. So this is Lennard-Jones. Okay, you write only for typically you write for van der Waals equation. That's what you learn. But let's say before. So we talked about now interactions between ions, charge, dipoles, induced dipoles, different combinations, 6 combinations. So one other interaction which is prevalent is hydrogen bonding. Okay, so we tend to give a place for hydrogen bonding different from others. But hydrogen bonding, if you see, can be put into one of these things, okay? Because, so you have, let's say, a peptide bond where you have an NH group, okay? Something like this. So it's forming hydrogen bond with a carbonyl group, okay? So now, so this is because you have delta what? Which one is delta plus? Okay, delta minus. So basically that's delta plus, right? Delta plus. H is delta plus. H is delta plus. Okay. Yeah, but basically you treat this delta plus because this is actually being donated. Okay. So let's say a proton which is attached to electronegative atom. Okay. And you have another highly electronegative atom which can actually attract this hydrogen. So this bonding, okay, now in principle can be put into one of these things. Okay, so where do you want to put it? Basically this. So this is not really a formal charge. It's not -1, it's not +1. So it's not ion, or it's not charge. But this is kind of
dipole can be think of.
Dipole you can really think of. CO itself is actually. So you can actually put this interaction partially into that. But specifically this, because if it is not there, then you can actually could have put these two into that. But hydrogen is involved, so that's why we give a special place for hydrogen bonding. And this, it depends on the angle. Okay. So this is basically whether this hydrogen is along the line joining this electronegative atom or not, the strength of this bonding is different. Okay. So these are the classes of interactions between side chains. So you can have any of these possible interactions. So let's say when I say a alpha helix is actually formed, so the hydrogen bonding along the backbone, as we know, okay, 3.6 angstrom per pitch, orientation, etc., for all the backbone. But now all the side chains are actually hanging outside. But imagine if you have two long side chains, one is lysine and another is glutamic acid in the neighborhood. So along the helix, now they can actually interact and stabilize the helix further through charge-charge interaction. So in addition to the hydrogen bonding, which is provided by the backbone, but now we have additional interaction because the side chains can actually come in close contact. Or when we talk about tertiary interactions, let's say helix bundle in myoglobin, okay, how they are placed within the myoglobin. Now the side chains on the helices of two different helices, when they combine together, so these side chains on one helix can actually interact with the side chains on the other. And depending on pairwise interactions, so you can actually classify into any of these interactions. So now multitude of these interactions bring together, stabilize the entire molecule, And then these interactions are not permanent. So as the molecule actually synthesized on the ribosome, every amino acid is actually being added. And then, so the molecule actually tries to sample all possible conformations. Okay, I wouldn't say all possible conformations. We'll come back later. Basically, in a way, it knows that, okay, the moment one stabilizing interactions, upon that you build another stabilizing interactions. Okay, and occasionally maybe non-stabilizing interactions, but then which will go away. For example, let's say two positive charges are bumping into each other. Or suddenly they just go away, rearrange the molecule. And then quickly the entire molecule rearranges to get tertiary and secondary and tertiary and sometimes quaternary structure. Okay, but to think this is the way to go for the pairwise interaction. But let's say if you have to put all these interactions to get the relative scale about which one is stronger and etc. So now let's say we make a big graph. Okay, so where there are, okay, so let's say if this is your van der Waals interaction, okay, between two moieties. Now let's see the two moieties are, let's say, assume hydrogen bonding. Okay, so suddenly let's say you have two moieties which have van der Waals interaction, but suddenly there's only those two particles. Now let's interact with hydrogen bonding. Then actually your interaction actually will go slightly smaller. Okay, so that is van der Waals. Okay, so this is, let's say, okay, typically high bonding. The idea of showing on this graph is that to show you the relative stabilization of hydrogen bonding with respect to van der Waals. So show that the van der Waals stabilization is weaker than the hydrogen bonding because this is cysteine, right? Versus this. But let's say on the same scale, if you have to represent these two particles are ions, okay, one is positive and another is negative. So then the stabilization comes much higher. Okay, so this is basically ion. So shows that this is really strong. Okay, that's basically if you have to represent. Okay, so now I'll show you some slides. Even if they are ions, basically they're nuclear colliding, right? So why the repulsion comes? The electron cloud repelling. Okay, so basically that. And finally, it's basically kind of because it's not really bonding. So if it is a bond, they come together and then say it's locked, covalent bond. But we are not really saying that they haven't really formed a bond. Okay, but now this electron distribution on one atom is actually colliding with each other. Okay, so that is general for whether it's van der Waals or hydrogen bonding or ion-ion interaction. Okay, so now I'll share screen and then show you some slides. Okay, am I on the right? Right, so repulsion should occur when they are very close, even if they are ions, because you can't really bump into the entire electron cloud. I'm sorry? I'm assuming what? You stop assuming that they're pointed. Yeah, so because you have to consider it's not just one electron and proton, right? So it's basically you have a nucleus and you have a lot of other electrons. Okay. Okay, so whatever I taught today, okay, is basically this. Okay, so the first one is charge. So these are actually permanent charges, and then example could be lysine side chain versus with an acid CO. So that's basically 1/. These are the longest and non-directional, like I said. Okay, assuming that these are point charges. So charge dipole is 1/r², and orientation of the dipole is actually important. And then example could be a charged lysine versus, let's say, a permanent dipole here. I think he's showing as water molecule. So water is actually has a permanent dipole moment. So it could be basically a charge on the surface of the protein with the water molecule, or it could be two groups within the protein. Okay, so you always have to actually account for the functional groups which are completely exposed on the surface of the molecule in proteins are always interacting with the surrounding. That's typically the solvent water, or if other ions are buffer ions present in the solution and salt. Okay, so dipole. So this is how actually you represent a dipole. So positive and negative charge and the direction. So that's basically the dipole. So it's a vectorial quantity in a molecule. So two dipoles, when they are oriented, you have dipole-dipole interactions. So that's basically mutual orientation is important. Basically, both how they are oriented with respect to each other is important. And so typically when I teach fluorescence spectroscopy, I teach this dipole-dipole because they're what's called fluorescence resonance energy transfer, or Foster resonance energy transfer, is a very important phenomena in fluorescence FRET. So where actually the interactions are dipole-dipole. So there we talk about not only R, the relative orientation. There is something called orientation factor, where you really think about the line joining, how the individual dipoles, what is the angle they are making, θ1 and θ2, and you can actually beautiful expressions you can actually derive. So analytical expressions are possible. But let's say simple R dependence is 1/R3. So mutual orientation of the dipoles is important. Another is charge between charged moieties and molecules which are non-polar. So they can have induced dipole moment. So that's why it's put the dotted line, dotted arrow, means that it's not permanent. It's induced only in the presence of a charge. So examples are, for example, like lysine and then let's say phenylalanine or simple benzene ring, where typically this is non-polar. You don't have any dipole, permanent dipole, but the dipole is actually induced, okay, depending on the charge in the neighborhood. Means that they are forced to brought together because of the backbone is actually allowing them to bump into each other. In that case, they interact with 1/R4. And then this depends on the polarizability of the induced dipole. How easily you can actually deform the electron cloud within the molecule. It depends. If you can do that easily, then it's a very stabilizing interaction. If you can't, then the interactions won't be that strong. It depends on the polarizability of the molecule in which dipole is induced. Dipole-dipole interaction, dipole-induced dipole, again, dipoles can induce dipole in other molecules. And this is 1/R5. Again, polarizability of the molecule where actually induced dipole is being induced is important. And also the orientation of the dipole. And the dispersion interactions are van der Waals interactions or London interaction forces are between two moieties which transiently develop dipoles. And you see in one case, a dipole is developed but corresponding dipole is developed on this molecule. You see the charges, the orientation actually very important. But the moment this, like I said, transient dipoles, it's not that they are not permanent. Suddenly the first one actually flips, and then second one is actually equally flips. Okay. So unlike the dipole where actually they are fixed. Okay. That's why the dipole of a helix is fixed. Okay. So, but here this interactions, depending on what is the direction of the induced dipole, the corresponding induced dipole direction is quickly realigns. Okay. And this is very actually important in stacking interactions. Nothing but hydrophobic interaction. So this is basically 1 over R6 dependent. Okay. And hydrogen bond is basically distance between the atom which is actually donating hydrogen versus the atom. Okay. So this is basically kind of chart. Nice. I like this is from a book. This is not from the literature. So this actually nicely summarizes in one panel how the R dependence, because I like to see R1, R2, R3, R4, R5, R6 beautifully. Okay. And that's basically the R dependence. But then in terms of energy, if you have to really plot the one shown on the board, R versus interaction energy, so then you can actually see the interaction energy in terms of, let's say, kilojoules per mole or kilocalorie per mole. See, hydrogen bonding interactions, they're about like 5 to, I think, 20 kilojoule per mole. Okay. Ion interactions should be much stronger. Actually, slightly more than this, I guess. Depending on which textbook, which source you see, small variation. But definitely ion interactions are actually strongest. So here it shows that 20 to 40 kilojoule per mole. And hydrophobic interactions are basically induced dipole interactions are actually again weaker than, well, see, hydrophobic interactions, that's the next class actually we are going to talk about. This is slightly different than van der Waals interactions. Van der Waals interactions are the weakest, but hydrogen bond interactions are slightly stronger than van der Waals. That's what I shown on the board. And ion interactions are much stronger. Hydrophobic interactions, I think we'll dedicate one class because there's slightly a different concept, because it's not just two moieties are involved, but the properties of water actually important. Okay, hydrogen bonds, they're about 5% strength of carbon-carbon bond. Okay, carbon-carbon bond is few hundred kilojoules per mole, very strong, covalent bonds. So all the bonds which we talked about today are non-covalent interactions. Okay.
Sir, I have a question. Yes. So, sir, those ion and ion interactions are much more stable than those hydrogen bonding interactions.
Yes, yes.
But in protein structure, mostly we found hydrogen bonding interactions. So is it because the constraint imposed on the structure by Ramachandran angles?
No. See, hydrogen bond interactions, because you have, if you see per molecule, you have a lot of NH and CO, but you won't have so many ions. Okay, if you, out of 20 amino acids, okay, the fraction of side chains which are ionic, okay, are not 100%, right? So obviously we will not have a lot of charges. That's one reason, because every amino acid provides a hydrogen bond acceptor and hydrogen bond donor, because you have NH and you have CO. Okay. So almost like one hydrogen bond per amino acid is guaranteed, but you don't have one charged moiety per amino acid is not guaranteed.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
So, sir, a small problem regarding that Liouville-Jones potential, sir. Can I ask?
Yeah, LJ potential, yes.
Sir, the mathematical expression has been given is 1 by R12 minus 1 by R6.
Yeah.
So the value will be negative when the R will be fractional. Only when the R positive when the R will be fractional, sir. So am I correct, sir?
No. What do you mean fractional? So I'm showing van der Waals interaction. So this purple thing which is shown on the top is 1 over R power 12 dependence. and the sign is
Okay.
positive because everything is positive. Whether it is R is small or large, 1 over R power 12 is positive.
No, no, sir. I'm talking about that whole equation, 1 by R12 minus 1 by R6, the equation which you was showed.
Yes.
So here only if the R will be the fractional, RV will be fractional, then only there will be an increase in potential. The potential will be positive. And if the R will be greater than 1, then it will be negative. So what?
It's not like that. Think
It's
about
not
it.
like.
I have given two curves here. Okay, the purple is
Okay.
equation for 1 over R power 12, and the
Yeah.
cyan below is 1 for R power 6. Only thing is that one on the positive side and one on the negative side is because of the 1 power R power 12, the sign is positive. For 1 power R
Okay.
power 6 is sign is negative, minus. Okay, so individually I
Okay.
plotted these two. Now, if
Okay.
you
Okay.
add these two, you get yellow. What is I'm showing is yellow, is basically summation of that. Okay, R basically that LJ equation which I have written. Does that clarify?
Yes, sir.
It doesn't matter whether fractional or anything. You take any R.
Okay.
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 Yeah.
Okay.
So you plot independently 1 over R per 12.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
What is the value? It's always positive, right? Only thing is that when R is large, it's close to 0. But R is small, then it's begin to climb. But the same R, if it is power 6, then the rate at which actually it increases is slower, but the sign is negative. So that's why I put it at the bottom. But if you add these two, you get beautiful this LJ curve, yellow one, where actually there is a minimum, okay, at a certain R. That clarifies?
Okay, sir.
Okay, so let's go back to, these are just information slides, okay. Yeah, so, yeah, so electric dipole water is basically as a permanent dipole moment. These, what is hydrogen bond strength and etc. These are important because this is one of the deciding factor for the proteins to fold, because it has a dielectric of epsilon 80. So that again dictates the charges, okay, which are on the surface, how much they might be screened, okay, with respect to others. So this is a typically kind of hydrogen bond. You see NH coming from the peptide bond, again CO coming from another peptide bond, gives rise to these nice hydrogen bonds. In the case of alpha helices or helices, mostly they are linear. In the case of anti-parallel beta strands, they are linear, but only parallel beta strands, they are actually angular. So the strength is slightly less. Ionic interactions, okay, they're about again, hydrogen bond is what, less, about 5%. Okay, so ionic interactions are much stronger than hydrogen bond interactions, but definitely much smaller than covalent interactions. So roughly about the 10% they are saying, okay? So for example, if you put water, sodium chloride in water, then of course you have positive and negative ions. Then you can actually think of these ion interactions for the positive sodium and negative chloride ions in the dielectric medium of water with epsilon. Okay, and this is what to think, for example, like how the sodium chloride might dissolve in water, okay, and begin to interact with even water molecules. And then that might have some effect on how strongly the charges between, let's say, sodium and chloride might be screened, because we have no water layer, okay? So then that might not allow to interact the sodium and chloride much closer than in solid, okay? Of course, you have to really think about interaction about other molecules in aqueous medium, not only just water and salt, but sometimes if you work with ambient conditions, then you have actually dissolved oxygen, okay, which is very important parameter, because some groups might be oxidized just oxygen is present. This oxygen is actually even important in other reactions like disulfide bond formation. So it's not very small, it's significant amount. It's like 3.5 grams per liter at 50 degrees Celsius. So that has some effect. Actually, CO2 is even higher. That's surprising. CO2 is 9 almost 1 gram per liter. Okay. Okay, so, and yeah, you don't have to worry about ammonia and hydrogen sulfide because they are not really.
So, which one is more soluble then, ammonia or hydrogen sulfide, if we see at a particular temperature? So, here the temperatures are different now in water.
Yes, I think, yeah, these data are taken from different studies. So they are at different, different temperatures. Ammonia at 10 degrees.
Okay, so is ammonia more soluble or hydrogen sulfide?
I think to the extent they're soluble that they are so high that you don't have to really worry about.
Okay, okay.
I think that's important factor. Well, solubility, you mean, for example, like see ammonia itself. See, solubility is a different aspect by altogether. Okay. So the moment you are actually adding more and more ammonia to water, to a stage at which you have 1-to-1, okay, stoichiometry, and if you add more ammonia, then actually you would call solubilizing water in ammonia. Okay. So the concept of solubility, you have to be very careful. So we worry about solubility when you have very small quantities, okay? But here we are talking about, for example, like ammonia. So it could be soluble a lot so that you can put more and more ammonia because ammonia likes another ammonia molecules and it becomes ammonia liquid. And then you have sparsely populated water molecules, okay? Van der Waals interactions are much weaker. I think the weakest of all these non-covalent interactions in general. You mean in the solubility? Quadrupolar interactions. Could be. It's possible. Yeah. It's possible. It's possible. But the important aspect is that, so typically that we are talking about solubility. But if, let's say, if they interact with other functional groups and then can undergo reactions, that's actually much more dangerous. So in that sense, oxygen is actually more reactive. No, we are talking about basically just comparing oxygen and carbon dioxide. Ammonia and all this, yeah, they form ions. Okay. But the reactivity wise, oxygen can actually damage much more, kind of permanent damage. But ammonia can actually interact, but it's kind of buffer medium. You know, so in that sense, it's not that reactive, I would say. Okay, it's interactive, but not reactive. There is a difference, right? Interactive means that we can apply any of these interactions, but not making any permanent changes in the bond structure. But oxygen is dangerous. Okay, it can actually modify very quickly. So van der Waals are the weakest of all interactions by far. And then, but still, they are so important. You'll see that in dictating the molecular structure, or how the molecules actually attain their structure from a non-native structure. Actually, van der Waals interactions play an important role because though they are weak for individual interactions per se, but if you have a numerous of van der Waals interactions compared to, let's say, few ion interactions, then actually they dictate. Okay, of course, their individual strength is weak, but if there are many interactions, then the overall strength actually dominates. That's actually what happens in protein folding. Or for example, like when a lizard is walking on a wall, you know, it's basically all the interactions are actually van der Waals interactions. These are the dispersion interactions, which actually dominate. And you can actually imagine how a spider is hanging from a ski ceiling, or a lizard is walking on a wall. Entirely, it's due to van der Waal interactions. Okay, that's the LJ potential. Okay, and also I showed you the van der Waals radii. And this is again just a tabular form showing now the interaction energy. So the ion dipole you see now here, actually this reference, I don't remember from where, it shows that 400 to 600 kilojoules. I mean, this is somehow slightly larger than the other thing. I don't know why 600. 600 seems really large. Yeah, right. Something is odd. Okay, something is odd. Hydrogen bond, they are putting 10 to 40, again slightly on the higher side. I think it's 5 to 10 kilojoule per mole. It can't be kilocal, right? Definitely. Dipole, again, put slightly lower than hydrogen bond, but anyway, relatively, you have to really see. And the dispersion are the induced dipole are the weakest. They're much weaker than even hydrogen bond or even dipole, etc. Okay. This is basically examples coming from non-proteinaceous field, simple other molecules. I think that's all for today. So next class, we'll talk about hydrophobic interactions. Maybe what I want to do is that, so next two classes, maybe I will not teach anything per se, but if you have any doubts, then I can actually clarify. And then next class, if next class is not enough, then we'll go another class, but then we will resume at most after 2 classes. We'll come back with another important interactions called hydrophobic interactions. Okay, so what are these hydrophobic interactions, and then why actually we have to classify them separately than this non-covalent interactions which we talked about today, and why it is actually important, especially for biomolecules, and very important role it plays in protein folding. Okay, so we'll talk about hydrophobic interactions or hydrophobic collapse.
Sir, I have a question.
Yes.
That in the last class we are dealing with the protein structures. So
yes.
If we see the protein structure, primary structure of protein, it is a linear sequence of the amino acids.
Yes.
Right. So if we see the RNA structure, it is also linear structure of the nucleotides. So like protein folding, does the RNA can be attain the three-dimensional structure through the folding?
Oh yeah. So I showed you, I think, if I remember correctly, couple of when we are discussing about DNA and RNA, I showed you some ribosomal RNA, big structure. You know, it forms actually hairpins with a lot of bulges, circular structures. I told you one tRNA has a complex structure. So there is something field of research called RNA folding. You know, so it's not really easy to predict RNA folding. Again, but the question is that RNA, you have this quote unquote side chain variety is only 4.
Right? Yes, sir.
But in the case of, and all 4 are actually neutral side chains. You won't have even have iron worry, right? But the protein side chains, on the other hand, you have 20, okay?
Yes, sir.
And if you see the backbone, okay, so you have the peptide bond brings some rigidity, and then flexibility is only at the C alpha on either side, phi and psi. Okay, so given these interesting combination of properties of peptides, okay, you could actually get secondary structures and then put in the Ramsden bond. But the same thing, I don't think you can really do for RNA, because if you see the backbone, there are phosphodiester bonds. They're actually single bonds. Okay, and then sugar puckering. Okay, so it does not really allow you kind of phi and psi, because then you have to define more other angles. And that doesn't really dictate the structure. The structure dictation is mainly because of the base pair stacking.
Okay, sir.
Okay, so base pair interactions coming from either the hairpin and the base pair stacking. Okay, these are the main interactions. So okay, the rules which govern for RNA molecules to get their structure. Well, in terms of the interactions, of course, we should be able to classify. But in terms of traditional rules, they are different. But in the case of proteins, I mean, in the case of RNA, you can actually fix, okay, if I have, let's say, A, okay, then you have U.
Yes, sir.
You won't even have G and C combination. That's completely missing, right?
Yes, sir.
And if you have G, you have C. So basically, the rules are actually much simpler, relatively.
Yes,
but let's
sir.
say, can you say the same thing about 20 different amino acid side chains? Let's say if I take a side chain of, let's say, lysine, I have 20 other combinations, including another lysine. All right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so then it will be like 20 to 20 combination table you're actually worrying about. But there it is actually AU and GC, period. AU, GC, or UHCG. That's all. So that
So,
actually changes it. Let me pull out this slide. I think I showed you one. I don't remember. Okay, one of this first slide. I think when we talked about RNA, I remember. DNA tetraplexus. Yes. So this is the example I remember. You see, this is this single RNA molecule. Okay, let me read. Base paired helical structures in RNA. Shown here is a possible secondary structure of the M1K and M1 RNA component of the enzyme RNase P of E. coli. Okay, so this is an enzyme by itself because it catalyzes some reaction. Okay, and it's based on RNA. So you see the hairpins which are base paired regions are actually shown. So anything which is shown on the circle, for example, the structure of this position, you cannot really predict. It's completely flexible.
okay, sir. Okay, sir.
This forms nice hairpin. Okay. Even interestingly, if you have this kind of small bulge, you know, it says that it's expense because it wants to form long hairpin, long base paired hairpin. It wants to even kick out two G's, which are not actually forming this. And you see in this hairpin, there are a small bulge, you know, at the expense of a long, longish hair, double-stranded.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Structure. Okay, so this is kind of you're right. But if you see the same thing in three dimensions, it will look much more complicated globular molecule. Okay, but yes, RNA structures are there, but we don't really know how exactly it arrives from the
Sir.
This is people have been really trying to understand that, but it's not difficult to predict. You know, if someone has given this sequence and then say that it's a single RNA molecule without any complementary strand, can you predict the structure? It's not that easy. Okay. Okay,
sir. Another thing to make that in the protein structure there are the side chain amino acids which are charged. Say lysine and aspartate. They can form salt-base type interactions. So yes, their charges are somehow reduced. So if we see the RNA structure, there are phosphate backbones. So right, how the charge during the folding, how the charges are neutralized? Is there any metal ions are playing a crucial role for their folding or something?
Yeah, so metal ions are actually very crucial, and even for DNA, you know, you have phosphates. So they are actually, of course, on the outside, but they are typically stabilized by other salt interactions, magnesium, you know, mostly I think magnesium, but sometimes other metal ions. Metal ions are actually play a very crucial role.
Okay, sir.
Especially I know tetraplexus because I work. They're actually like potassium, sodium are very, very, very important. And typically for DNA, things, magnesium plays a crucial role in stabilizing these structures. I think magnesium actually neutralizes.
Okay, sir.
It's a
Okay, sir.
bivalent thing. Yeah. Counter ions are actually very, very important. So salts are in buffered solution of DNA or RNA, whether it is single stranded, double stranded, very crucial.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Sir, another thing to make the when we are dealing with the transcription factor, the zinc fingers you made that the so why nature choose the only Zn 2 plus atom, not other atoms say iron 2 plus or cobalt 2 plus or anything else?
No. So you have to realize that there are certain transition metal ions which which are electroactive in the sense that they can actually change their oxidation states.
Yes, sir.
So that they can actually push and pull electrons very easily.
Yes, sir.
Right. So that's for example, the function of iron, because iron can be in +2, it can be in +3. Okay.
Yes, sir.
So you want to really put then iron in places where actually this oxidation state change is important.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
Okay, sir.
On the other hand, let's say you need ions to neutralize or ions to play a passive role, means that their oxidation states are fixed. So they provide either neutralization or they provide a structure. Then you put,
Yes, sir.
for example, like zinc. So zinc doesn't change its oxidation state, but it brings nicely histidines and cysteines clustered together. Okay, in a certain geometry like tetrahedral geometry.
Okay,
so
sir.
Then you want to really put ions where actually this. So you can segregate this as a structural role, where actually the ions give nice structure, but sometimes ions actually change their oxidation states. So if they are involved in, let's say, during the protein function, for example, in enzymes, where you want to really push and pull electrons, okay? So then you want additional support given by transition metal ions like iron, okay?
Okay, sir. Got it. Got it.
Okay, I think it's getting long, so let's conclude here. And so next class, I won't teach anything, but you come with any doubts. I'll try my best to clarify if I can. Okay?
Thank you, sir.
Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.